You can't afford a lawyer. My father's voice cut through the courtroom like a cold wind in January, sharp and deliberate, carrying across the rows of wooden benches with the kind of casual cruelty that only someone who has never been challenged can muster. It wasn't just loud. It was calculated, meant to humiliate, meant to remind everyone in that room exactly where he believed I stood in the grand hierarchy of things. I remember the way his words seemed to hang in the air, suspended for just a moment before settling over the gallery like a weight. A few people shifted in their seats, not out of sympathy, no, but out of that uncomfortable curiosity that makes small-town courtrooms feel like theaters. There's something about watching someone else's pain that turns it into quiet entertainment when you're not the one feeling it. I stood there alone at the plaintiff's table, my hands steady at my sides even though my chest felt like it had been hollowed out with something dull and rusted. The chair beside me was empty, intentionally so. I had chosen to face this without representation, though no one in that room understood why yet. The judge adjusted her glasses, glancing down at the file before her with the measured consideration of someone who had seen every type of human conflict pass across her desk. Then she looked up at me, not with pity, but something else entirely. Something that looked almost like recognition. She won't need one. For a moment, the entire room went still. You could hear the ventilation system humming overhead, could hear someone's pen stop scratching against paper mid-word. Across the aisle, my father's attorney, Mr. Halpern, a man who had built his reputation crushing people like me under the weight of legal technicalities and expensive procedures, froze mid-sentence. His hand hovered above his notes like a bird unsure whether to land or take flight. "My God," he whispered, barely audible, the words slipping out before he could catch them. "Is that really her?" And that's when I saw it. The color draining from my father's face like someone had pulled a plug somewhere inside him, his shoulders tightening beneath his dark suit jacket, his hand gripping the edge of the table like it might somehow steady him against what was coming. For the first time in my life, my father looked afraid of me. But to understand how we got here, to understand why a respected businessman in a small Ohio town would find himself trembling in a courtroom, while his daughter stood tall without a single attorney beside her, you have to go back. You have to understand what it took to build someone who could stand in that silence and not break. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been dismissed, if you've ever been made to feel like your voice didn't matter in rooms where decisions about your life were being made without you, then I need you to stay with me through this story. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about revenge or justice or winning in court. It's about what happens when someone who has been silenced for decades finally finds the strength to speak. It's about patience that looks like weakness until it becomes the very thing that brings an empire down. Hit that like button if you've ever dreamed of standing up to someone who made you feel small. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that quiet people often have the loudest stories to tell, and settle in. Because this is going to take a while. And I promise you, every moment will be worth it. It hadn't always been like this. There was a time, decades before that courtroom, when my father, Robert Callahan, was the kind of man people stood up for when he entered a room. In our town of Greenville, Ohio, his name carried weight the way few names did. He owned half the commercial strip downtown, those brick buildings with their faded awnings and small businesses that had been there for generations. He had served 2 terms on the county board, positioning himself as a pillar of the community, someone whose opinion mattered in matters of commerce and governance alike. Growing up, I believed what everyone else believed. I believed he was strong, fair, a provider, someone who built things that lasted. I believed I should be grateful to be his daughter. I was the eldest, born in 1963, right when things were changing in this country. The world outside our small town was shifting, women pushing into spaces they had been shut out of for generations, demanding seats at tables they had only served before. But not in my father's house. In his world, sons built legacies and daughters supported them. That was the natural order of things, as immutable in his mind as the changing of seasons or the movement of tides. I learned early not to argue, not because I couldn't formulate an argument, but because it never mattered. My opinions, my thoughts, my desires were like leaves blowing against the side of a brick building. They made no impression, left no mark, and eventually you stopped trying. I was a good student, quiet but sharp in the way that people sometimes mistook for simple compliance. Numbers made sense to me in a way people didn't. They were honest, consistent. They didn't change the rules halfway through an equation based on what was convenient for them. By the time I graduated high school, my guidance counselor pulled me aside during one of those last chaotic weeks when everyone was signing yearbooks and pretending they would stay in touch forever. "Linda," she said, leaning back in her creaking office chair, "you could go far, further than most." I held on to that sentence like a secret, like a small flame I could cup my hands around when everything else felt cold. You could go far. Someone had seen something in me beyond what my father wanted them to see. I went to Ohio State on a partial scholarship, working nights at a diner just to cover what my father wouldn't. He told people around town that he was supporting my education, that he was investing in his daughter's future, and I suppose in a technical sense he was, if you counted not actively preventing me from leaving as support. But the truth was he barely noticed I was gone. The house was quieter, perhaps, one less plate at dinner, one less body moving through the hallways, but his life continued exactly as it had before. I was not essential to it. I was not central to anything he cared about. And in a strange way, that freedom was the greatest gift he could have given me, though he never intended it as such. College was the first time I felt like I could breathe. Do you know what that feels like? To go years without even realizing you've been holding your breath, and then suddenly find yourself in a place where the air is different, where no one is watching you with expectations you can never meet. I studied finance at first, drawn to the clarity of it, the way numbers could tell stories that people tried to hide. But then I shifted into pre-law, and something about it felt like coming home. The structure, the logic, the idea that truth could actually matter somewhere, that there were systems designed to weigh evidence and arrive at something approaching justice. For a while, I let myself believe that the world could be fair, that merit meant something, that being right was enough. I graduated near the top of my class. I even got into law school at the University of Michigan, one of the best programs in the country. That was the moment everything changed, though I didn't know it yet. I still remember sitting at the kitchen table, the acceptance letter in my hands, trying to keep my voice steady because I had learned that showing too much emotion around my father was dangerous. Showing hope was dangerous. "I got in," I said. "University of Michigan." My mother smiled softly from across the room, the way she always did. Small smiles, like she was afraid to take up too much space, afraid that someone might notice she existed and demand she justify it. My father didn't look up right away. He was reading the paper, the Greenville Daily News, folded crisply in half, his eyes moving across headlines that probably didn't even interest him. "That's out of state," he said finally. "Yes, but they offered financial aid, student loans. I can make it work." "You're not going." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. My father had never needed to raise his voice to control the people around him. He simply decided things and they became true. I felt something inside me crack, a small fracture in something I hadn't even known was solid. "I can make it work," I said again, more carefully this time, trying to negotiate with someone who had never negotiated anything in his life. "You're needed here." Those words carried more weight than anything else he had ever said to me. Needed, not wanted, not supported, not believed in, needed. For what exactly, he never fully explained, but I understood. My younger brother Daniel had just started working with him in the business. My mother's health was beginning to slip, small things at first, forgetfulness, fatigue, moments of confusion that we all tried to ignore. Someone had to hold things together. And in my father's mind, that someone was me. Not because I was particularly suited for it, not because it was what I wanted, but because I was available, I was female, and I had never learned to say no. So I stayed. I told myself it was temporary. A year, maybe two. Help out, get things stable, then go back to the life I had started to build for myself. That's what I believed. That's what I needed to believe because the alternative was admitting that my father had just erased my future with 6 words, and I had let him. At first, it didn't feel like a sacrifice. I worked in the office, organizing accounts, reviewing contracts, catching mistakes Daniel didn't even know he was making because he had never been taught to look for them. My father started relying on me more than he ever admitted. Reports would appear on his desk without him asking. Problems would be solved before they became crises, and the business ran smoothly in ways that he took credit for in public and ignored in private. But he never said thank you, not once. And he certainly never put my name on anything. I was an invisible engine, essential to the operation of the machine, but never acknowledged as part of it. Years passed the way they tend to when you're not paying attention. Quietly, relentlessly. My mother got sicker, and I became her primary caregiver because someone had to, and that someone was always going to be me. Doctor visits, medications, long nights sitting beside her bed when she couldn't sleep, holding her hand and listening to her breathe, wondering when exactly my life had become this quiet thing I was living instead of the loud, vibrant thing I had dreamed of. Daniel got married, had kids, bought a house on the nice side of town. My father praised him endlessly. Good man, he'd say, carrying on the family name, building something that lasts. And I would be standing right there, holding a stack of financial reports that proved the business was only still standing because of me, because of the hours I had put in, the mistakes I had caught, the money I had saved them. But I stayed quiet, because that's what I had always done. Because I had learned that speaking up changed nothing, it only made things harder. The first time I realized I had been erased was subtle. A client came into the office looking confused, an older man who had been doing business with my father for years. I was told to speak with the person handling our accounts, he said, looking past me toward the inner office where my father sat. That would be me, I replied, keeping my voice pleasant, professional. He hesitated just for a moment, but long enough. Oh, he said, I thought. Well, Mr. Callahan mentioned his son. I forced a smile, the kind I had perfected over decades of being dismissed. Yes, I said. Daniel oversees operations. That wasn't entirely untrue, but it wasn't the truth either. Daniel oversaw whatever my father wanted him to oversee, which usually meant showing up late, leaving early, and taking credit for work he didn't understand. The actual operations, the actual work, happened in the margins, in the quiet hours when no one was watching, performed by someone no one thought to mention. By the time my mother passed, I was 52 years old, and I had nothing to show for 3 decades of labor except the understanding that I had given my life to people who considered me interchangeable. No career of my own. No savings that weren't tied to the family business. No recognition. Just years of work, thousands of hours, all of it invisible, all of it erased, tied to a name that wasn't mine and never would be. The reading of the will happened 3 months after the funeral, and I remember sitting in that same courtroom where I would eventually face my father, though it felt different then. Smaller somehow. Colder. The lawyer spoke in that careful, measured tone they all use, as if death were merely a legal technicality to be processed rather than a human loss to be grieved. And when he finished reading the documents, everything I thought I understood about my life collapsed. But that's not where this story begins. It begins with a man standing in a courtroom laughing at his own daughter, certain she had nothing left, certain she was still the same quiet woman who had spent decades standing just behind him, holding things together while he took the bows. He didn't know what I had been doing, what I had been preparing for, what I had become in the shadows of the life he had assigned to me. And as I stood there that day, watching the fear finally settle into his eyes, watching the color drain from his face, I realized something I wish I had understood a very long time ago. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it's just patience. Sometimes it's just the quiet accumulation of strength, the careful gathering of evidence, the slow building of something that will eventually become too heavy for anyone to ignore. When people look at a moment like that courtroom scene, they tend to think it came out of nowhere, like something sudden, a twist in a movie that no one could have predicted. But nothing about that day was sudden. It was built quietly, patiently, over years of nights spent alone with documents and law books while the rest of the house slept. Most people never noticed. They saw what they expected to see, a middle-aged woman who had never married, never left home, never amounted to anything beyond what her father allowed. They didn't see the mind working behind the silence. They didn't see the gears turning, the patterns emerging, the truth taking shape. After my mother passed, the house felt different. Not quieter exactly, because my father had never been a loud man unless he wanted to be heard, but emptier, like something essential had been removed and nothing had taken its place. My mother had been the softness in that house, the small kindnesses that made the hardness bearable. Without her, the rooms felt sharp-edged, the silences felt pointed, the air itself seemed to carry a weight that pressed down on your chest. I stayed, of course. There was nowhere else to go, and if I'm being honest, I didn't yet know how to leave. Grief has a way of keeping you still. It wraps itself around your routine, makes even the idea of change feel exhausting, impossible, like trying to move through water that has slowly turned to concrete. So I did what I had always done. I kept working. The office didn't stop just because my mother had. Bills still came in. Contracts still needed reviewing. Clients still expected answers, results, the competent management they had always received without ever knowing who was providing it. Daniel showed up less and less after the funeral. Kids have activities, he'd say when he bothered to offer an explanation. You understand. And I did. I always did. I understood that his responsibilities were flexible, negotiable, something he could pick up and put down as convenient, while mine were fixed, permanent, a prison I had built for myself, one obligation at a time. So I filled the gaps again. I answered the questions Daniel couldn't answer. I made the decisions Daniel was afraid to make. I kept the business running the way I always had, without complaint, without acknowledgement, without hope that anything would ever change. It was about a month after the funeral that I noticed something strange. A set of financial statements didn't line up. At first, I thought it was a simple clerical error, a transposed number, a forgotten entry, the kind of small mistake that happens when you're processing hundreds of transactions a month. That wouldn't have been unusual. Daniel had never paid much attention to details, but the more I looked, the less sense it made. Funds were being moved between accounts in ways that didn't follow any logical pattern. Expenses were being recorded twice in some places and not at all in others. Transfers were happening to accounts I didn't recognize, from entities I couldn't identify. I remember sitting there late one evening, the office lights dim, the numbers spread out in front of me like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not sadness, but clarity. A cold, sharp certainty that something was wrong, and it wasn't just careless bookkeeping. I brought it to my father the next morning. He was at his desk, reading the paper as usual, a cup of black coffee cooling beside him, the morning light filtering through the blinds and those slanted rays that always made the dust motes visible. I think there's an issue with the accounts, I said, keeping my tone even, professional. The tone I had learned to use when I needed to be heard without seeming to challenge. He didn't look up. Daniel handles that. I know, I said. That's why I'm concerned. That got his attention. He lowered the paper slowly, his eyes narrowing just slightly, the way they always did when he sensed someone stepping out of the role he had assigned them. What are you implying? Nothing, I said. I'm just saying something doesn't add up. We should review it together. For a moment, I thought just maybe that he would listen. That he would see what I had seen. That for once my voice might carry weight in a conversation that mattered. But then he leaned back in his chair, folding the paper neatly, carefully, the way he did everything. You're overthinking, he said. And just like that, it was dismissed. 3 decades of experience, thousands of hours of financial analysis, a lifetime of catching the mistakes other people made, reduced to 2 words that meant nothing and everything at once. I wish I could tell you that was the moment everything changed. That I stood up, demanded to be heard, refused to be ignored and dismissed like I had been my entire life. But I didn't. Not yet. Because the truth is, when you've spent decades being overlooked, you start to question your own instincts. You start to wonder if maybe you are overthinking. Maybe you are imagining problems that aren't there. Maybe you are wrong, have always been wrong, will always be wrong, and the people who dismiss you are right to do so. So I let it go on the surface. I nodded, I walked away, I returned to my desk and my work and the quiet life I had accepted. But something inside me had shifted. Something small, something quiet, but something undeniable. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the numbers in my head, the inconsistencies, the patterns that didn't fit. And then something else surfaced, something I hadn't allowed myself to think about in a long time. Law school, the dream I had buried so deep I had almost forgotten it was there. I got out of bed around 2 in the morning and walked into the living room. The house creaked the way old houses do, settling into its foundation, remembering things, carrying the weight of decades in its bones. I sat down at the small desk near the window, the one I used to help my mother with her paperwork, and opened my laptop. The screen glowed blue-white in the darkness, illuminating my face like a confession. It took me a few minutes to find what I was looking for: old records, bar requirements, continuing education courses, the rules that governed whether someone who had walked away from a legal career 30 years ago could ever come back to it. I didn't even know if it was possible anymore. At 55, most people were thinking about retirement, planning trips they would never take, imagining a future where work became optional. They weren't thinking about starting over. But I kept reading, and the more I read, the more something familiar returned. That same quiet certainty I had felt all those years ago, sitting in that guidance counselor's office, hearing her say you could go far, before I gave it up, before I let someone else decide what my life would be. The next morning, I made a decision. I didn't tell anyone, not my father, not Daniel. There was no point. They wouldn't have understood. They would have dismissed it the way they dismissed everything I did that didn't serve their interests. And for once, I didn't need them to understand. I didn't need their permission. I started small. Online courses at first, refresher material, legal updates, the foundational knowledge that had grown dusty from decades of disuse. I'd work during the day just like always, managing the business, handling the crises, keeping everything running smoothly. Then at night, when the house was quiet and the demands of the day had finally released their grip, I would study. At first, it was exhausting. My mind wasn't as quick as it used to be. I had to reread things, take notes more carefully, fight against the fog that settles in when you've spent 30 years using only a fraction of your capacity. But something interesting happened. After a few weeks, it started coming back. Not just the knowledge, but the way of thinking. The way legal problems unfold step by step, detail by detail, building arguments like structures, each piece supporting the next. It was like a language I hadn't spoken in years suddenly returning, the vocabulary rising from somewhere deep in my memory, the grammar reasserting itself in my thoughts. Around that time, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly 3 decades. Professor Alan Green. He had been one of my instructors during my brief time in law school, a fair man, quiet, observant, the kind of person who saw things others missed. I didn't expect him to remember me. Why would he? I had been just another student, quiet, diligent, unremarkable in any way that would stick in someone's memory for 30 years. But when I called, his voice older but still steady, he said my name like no time had passed at all. Linda Callahan. You were one of my best students. I didn't know what to say to that, so I told him the truth, or at least part of it. We met for coffee a few days later at a small cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place where nobody would recognize us or think anything of 2 older people sitting in a corner booth. He listened more than he spoke. That hadn't changed. He had always been someone who understood that silence could be its own form of engagement, that listening was an active process, that the space between words often contained more meaning than the words themselves. I explained what I had found in the financial records, the inconsistencies, the way my concerns had been dismissed, the feeling that something was deeply wrong beneath the surface of the business I had given my life to. He nodded slowly, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup, his eyes thoughtful. And you want to know if you're imagining it, he said. I hesitated. Yes. He took a sip of his coffee, then set the cup down carefully, deliberately, the way he did everything. No, he said. You're not. That was the moment everything truly began. Not the courtroom, not the confrontation, but that quiet confirmation that I wasn't wrong, that what I saw mattered, that my instincts were valid even if everyone around me had spent decades trying to convince me otherwise. Professor Green didn't offer dramatic advice. He didn't tell me to take anyone down or start a legal battle. Instead, he said something simple. If you believe something is wrong, he told me, document everything carefully, thoroughly, patiently. Truth has a way of revealing itself if you give it time, so that's what I did. I started keeping records, copies of documents, emails, financial statements, anything that felt even slightly out of place. I didn't confront anyone, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't demand to be heard, I simply observed. I became a student of my own life, watching the patterns I had lived inside for decades without ever really seeing them. Weeks turned into months. Patterns became clearer. And the deeper I looked, the harder it became to ignore what was right in front of me. Daniel wasn't just careless, and my father wasn't unaware. That realization didn't come all at once. It settled slowly like dust, accumulating so gradually you didn't notice until eventually it covered everything. And that's when I understood something I had spent most of my life avoiding. This wasn't just about being overlooked. This wasn't just about family dynamics or favoritism or the casual cruelty of a father who never saw his daughter as anything more than a support system for his son. This was something else entirely. Something that would not fix itself. Something that sooner or later would have to be faced. And for the first time in a very long time, I was ready. There's a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, when you realize something you can't unsee. For me, it came on a Tuesday afternoon. Nothing special about the day. The kind of gray Ohio sky that hangs low and makes everything feel smaller, like the world has contracted to the space between your skin and the air. I was at my desk reviewing a set of property transfers tied to one of our older commercial buildings downtown, a brick structure on Jefferson Street that had been in the family for generations. At first glance, everything looked routine. Documents signed, dates recorded, proper procedures apparently followed. But then I saw my name, or rather, the absence of it. The property in question was one I had personally managed for nearly 15 years. I had handled the tenants, negotiated leases, resolved disputes, made decisions about maintenance and improvements, every detail of its operation running through my hands. But according to the document in front of me, it had been transferred entirely into Daniel's name. Not recently, months ago. Signed, filed, final, I wasn't listed anywhere. Not as a manager, not as a beneficiary, not as someone who had ever been involved. I sat there for a long time staring at that page, not because I didn't understand it, but because I understood it too well. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate, systematic erasure. And it wasn't just this property. As I started looking more carefully, pulling files, cross-referencing dates and signatures, I found more transfers, more exclusions, more documents that should have included my name and didn't. Years of work reduced to nothing. Years of labor, assigned to someone else without even the courtesy of a conversation. That evening, I waited until my father was alone in the living room. He sat in his usual chair, the television on low, a glass of bourbon resting on the side table, the ice melted to slivers. I stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking, watching him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. "When were you going to tell me?" He didn't look up. "About what?" I walked in slowly, placing the document on the table in front of him, the paper crisp and accusing in the soft light of the lamp. "This." He glanced at it briefly, then leaned back, his expression unchanged. "That's business. Business. Such a simple word. So easy to hide behind. I managed that property for years," I said, keeping my voice steady the way I always did, the way I had been trained to do. "And you were compensated," he replied. "That's not the point." He finally looked at me then, his eyes flat, his expression unchanged. "It is exactly the point." I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet, something deeper. Something that had been building for 30 years and was finally finding its shape. "You transferred it without telling me. I don't need to consult you on family decisions." Family, that word again. Dragged out when it was convenient, ignored when it wasn't. Used to justify everything and explain nothing. I took a slow breath. Was it really a family decision? His eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you implying now?" I held his gaze, steady, unflinching. "I'm asking if Daniel knows what he's doing." Silence, just for a moment, but it was enough. That was the first crack. "You've always had a problem trusting your brother," my father said finally. "That's not what this is." "No," he said. "This is you overstepping, after everything, after 30 years. After giving up law school, giving up my future, giving up everything to hold together a business and a family that apparently saw me as nothing more than hired help who didn't need to be paid or acknowledged or informed." I looked down at the document again, then back at him. "There are discrepancies," I said quietly, "in multiple accounts. Transfers that don't make sense. Payments missing." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for his glass, taking a slow sip. Then he set it down. "Carefully, you need to stop digging," he said. There it was. Not denial, not confusion, a warning. I felt it then, clear as anything. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't carelessness. This was intentional. This was something they didn't want found. "I'm not trying to cause problems," I said. "Then stop creating them. I'm trying to understand." "No," he interrupted, his voice sharper now. "You're trying to insert yourself where you don't belong, where I don't belong. In a business I had helped build. In a family I had spent my life supporting. In a life I had sacrificed everything for." I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I understood something important in that moment. There would be no resolution here. Not privately. Not quietly. This was not a problem that could be solved with a conversation. I picked up the document and turned toward the door. "Linda." I stopped, but I didn't turn around. "Be careful," he said. I didn't answer, I didn't need to. That night, I didn't sleep at all. But this time it wasn't confusion keeping me awake. It was clarity. The next morning, I called Professor Green. He didn't sound surprised when I told him what had happened. "Tell me everything," he said, so I did. Every detail, every inconsistency, every conversation. The property transfers, the missing payments, the warning to stop digging. He listened just like before, patiently, the silence between us carrying its own weight. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he said something that changed everything. "You need to protect yourself." I sat back in my chair. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said carefully, "that if what you're describing is accurate, this could become legal." Legal. The word felt different now. Heavier, more real. "I don't have a lawyer," I said. "You may not need one," he replied. "Not yet." That sentence stayed with me. Over the next few weeks, things escalated quietly. Documents became harder to access. Accounts I used regularly were suddenly restricted. Doors that had always been open were now closed. Daniel stopped returning my calls. And then the letter arrived. It came by certified mail, addressed to me, formal, cold, the envelope heavy with implication. I opened it at the kitchen table, read it once, then read it again to make sure I had understood correctly. It was a notice from my father's attorney. I was being removed from all operational involvement in the business, effective immediately. No explanation, no discussion, no opportunity to respond. I remember sitting there, the paper in my hands, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not shock, not even anger, relief, because now everything was clear. They weren't just excluding me. They were preparing for something, and for the first time, so was I. The court date was set 2 months later, a civil matter on paper, a dispute over business assets and property assignments. But I knew better. This wasn't just about business or property. This was about control, about rewriting the past, about deciding who mattered and who didn't. And as I stood there in that courtroom, listening to my father laugh, hearing him say those words, "You can't afford a lawyer," I realized something. He still thought I was the same person, the woman who stayed quiet, who accepted things, who stepped back. He had no idea that I had already stepped forward. He had no idea what I had been doing in the quiet hours, in the stolen moments, in the spaces between the life he had assigned me and the life I was building for myself. By the time the court date was set, I had already accepted something most people spend years resisting. This wasn't going to fix itself. There would be no quiet conversation that suddenly made everything right, no late apology, no realization on their part that I had been there all along holding things together. That kind of ending belongs in stories people tell themselves when they're not ready to face the truth. I was ready. The first thing I did was simplify my life. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but quietly. I closed accounts that were tied to the business, moved what little savings I had into a separate bank, cut expenses where I could. It wasn't about fear. It was about independence. For the first time in decades, I needed to stand on my own, and I couldn't do that if I was still tangled in their systems. Professor Green became my anchor during that time. We didn't meet often, maybe once every couple of weeks, but every conversation mattered. He never told me what to do. He asked questions, careful ones, the kind that forced me to think clearly, to strip away the emotion and find the logic underneath. "Why do you believe they're doing this?" he asked during one of our meetings. I paused. "Control," I said. He nodded slightly. "And what do they believe about you?" I didn't hesitate. That I won't fight. That was the assumption everything else was built on, so I let them keep it. I didn't argue when I was removed from the office. I didn't demand access. I didn't make calls or send emails asking for explanations. From the outside, it probably looked like I had given up, like I had finally accepted my place. But inside, everything had changed. My days became structured in a way they hadn't been in years. Mornings were for research, afternoons for organizing documents, evenings for study. I went back over everything I had collected: financial records, property transfers, email correspondence. Every piece of paper told a story. Individually, they could be dismissed. A mistake here, a miscommunication there, but together they formed a pattern. And patterns are hard to ignore. I learned how to see those patterns more clearly. How to present them, how to build something from them. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about proving it. That distinction matters, especially in a courtroom. There were nights when it felt overwhelming. When I would sit at my desk surrounded by documents and wonder if I had waited too long, if I had let too much slip away, if I was simply outmatched. Those were the nights I would hear Professor Green's voice in my head. Truth doesn't rush, he had said once. It waits. So I kept going. About 3 weeks before the hearing, something unexpected happened. I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something told me to. "Ms. Callahan?" the voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is Margaret Ellis. I worked with your company, accounting mostly." I didn't recognize the name at first, but then she continued. "I don't work there anymore." That got my attention. We met 2 days later at a small cafe just outside town, the kind of place where people went when they didn't want to be seen. She looked nervous. Not afraid, but cautious, the way people look when they're about to cross a line they can't uncross. "I'm not here to get involved," she said before I even had a chance to speak. "I understand," I replied. She studied me for a moment like she was trying to decide something. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "I kept copies," she said. I didn't open it right away. I just looked at her. "Why?" She hesitated, then gave a small, tired smile because something didn't feel right. That was all she said, but it was enough. When I opened the folder later that night, everything changed. The records were detailed, precise, clear in a way mine hadn't been. Transfers that had been hidden, accounts that had been moved, signatures that didn't match, and most importantly, a timeline. It showed exactly when things had started to shift. Exactly how it had been done, and exactly who had been involved. I sat there for a long time after going through it, not because I didn't understand, but because I did. There was no more uncertainty, no more doubt. This wasn't negligence. This was intentional. The next morning, I called Professor Green. "You were right," I said simply. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't need to. "What will you do?" he asked. I looked out the window. The sky was clear for once. "Bright. I'll finish what I started." There was a pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Then make sure you do it with dignity." Dignity. That word stayed with me, because this wasn't about revenge in the way people usually think of it. It wasn't about anger or punishment or making someone suffer. It was about truth. And truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. In the days leading up to the hearing, I prepared everything carefully. Organized, clear. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't imagine confrontations. I focused on facts, because facts don't waver. The night before the court date, I sat at my kitchen table one last time. All the documents laid out in front of me. Everything I had gathered. Everything I had rebuilt. I wasn't nervous. Not in the way I expected. I felt calm. Not because I knew what would happen, but because I knew I had done everything I could. For the first time in a very long time, I trusted myself. And the next morning, I walked into that courtroom alone. Not because I had no one, but because I didn't need anyone to speak for me anymore. I had been in that courthouse before, but that morning, it felt different. Maybe it was because I was no longer walking in as someone trying to keep the peace. Maybe it was because I had finally stopped hoping my father would choose decency over pride. Or maybe it was because for the first time in my life, I understood that fear and calm can live in the same body at once. My hands were cold when I stepped through the metal detector. My purse felt heavier than it should have, filled with neatly labeled folders, legal pads, and reading glasses I kept having to remind myself not to misplace. The deputy at the front nodded politely. I nodded back. Everything looked ordinary. That was the strange part. The fluorescent lights still buzzed overhead. The tile floor still needed polishing. A vending machine still hummed down the hallway near the clerk's office. 2 men argued quietly over a property line dispute. A woman in a navy cardigan held a tissue in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. Life was going on all around me. And yet for me, that day would divide everything into before and after. My father was already inside when I entered the courtroom. He sat at the table with Daniel to his left and Mr. Halpern to his right, looking exactly the way he always had when he expected the world to bend in his direction. Dark suit, silver tie, chin slightly raised. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. That told me more than anything else could have. A man who believes he's right usually looks straight at you. A man who knows he's standing on rotten ground tends to study the table. I took my seat alone. Mr. Halpern glanced over and I could see the faint little smile in the corner of his mouth. He had the look of a man who had already written the ending. Then my father leaned back just far enough for me to hear him. "You can't afford a lawyer." He said it casually, as if it were no more important than commenting on the weather. But he wanted it heard. And it was. A few heads turned. Someone in the gallery shifted. Mr. Halpern gave a small, indulgent exhale as though he might have told my father not to say such a thing, though not because it was cruel, only because it was unnecessary. I looked at my father and said nothing. The old me would have looked down. The old me would have swallowed the insult, then spent hours later wondering why it still hurt. But something had changed in me over those months of study, of organizing, of finally trusting the quiet voice I had ignored for far too long. So I simply met his eyes and waited. When the judge entered, everyone stood. Judge Miriam Hensley was in her early 70s with short gray hair and a way of looking at people that made excuses seem very small. I had known of her for years. In towns like ours, certain names travel ahead of the people who carry them. She had a reputation for patience and for not being easily impressed. That morning, I was grateful for both. We sat. Papers rustled. The clerk reviewed the matter. A dispute over business assets, fiduciary responsibilities, and property assignments connected to Callahan Holdings. Hearing it read aloud that way made it sound tidy. It was not tidy. It was 20 years of unpaid labor, buried paperwork, manipulated transfers, and family history dressed up in legal language. Mr. Halpern rose first. He had one of those voices attorneys cultivate when they want to sound both confident and reasonable. He spoke about efficiency, continuity, operational necessity. He described me as someone who had been peripherally involved in clerical support, but had no formal ownership interest in the disputed entities. Peripherally involved. I nearly smiled. I had kept their books balanced, caught their errors, managed their properties, negotiated with their tenants, corrected their contracts, and on more than one occasion saved them from costly mistakes they never even knew they were making. Peripherally involved. There are lies so complete, they become almost elegant. Mr. Halpern continued building his neat little version of my life while my father sat beside him, hands folded, as calm as if he were attending a board meeting. Then the judge turned to me. "Ms. Callahan," she said, "do you have representation today?" "No, Your Honor." Before Mr. Halpern could even shift his weight, my father gave a faint, satisfied huff through his nose. Then Judge Hensley looked at the documents in front of her, looked back at me, and said in that steady, quiet voice, "She won't need one." The room changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Mr. Halpern stopped moving. His hand, which had been reaching for a yellow-tabbed exhibit, froze halfway there. He looked at me then, not with amusement, not with dismissal, but with recognition. Real recognition. "My God," he said under his breath, though loud enough for those nearest him to hear. "Is that really her?" I knew what he had seen, not my face exactly. My filing, the structure of it, the clarity, the citations. The organization of the exhibits. The old discipline returning in plain view. Years earlier, before I left law school, I had competed in appellate advocacy, quietly, successfully. My name had circulated in places my father never noticed because he had never cared to look beyond his own reflection. Men like Mr. Halpern did remember such things. Not always the person, but the workmanship. And workmanship leaves a signature. My father turned toward him. "What does that mean?" he whispered harshly. Mr. Halpern didn't answer. That was the moment I saw my father's confidence begin to crack, not because he suddenly understood everything, but because someone he trusted did. Judge Hensley invited me to proceed. I stood, opened my folder, and adjusted my glasses. My voice, when it came, surprised even me. It was calm, not theatrical, not trembling, just clear. "Your Honor, I would like to begin with Exhibit B, the transfer history related to the Jefferson Building, followed by the accounting summaries in Exhibits D through H." Mr. Halpern objected almost immediately, arguing relevance. I was ready for that. I responded point by point. Timeline. Connection. Pattern of transfer. Internal inconsistencies. Missing disclosures. Signature anomalies. The judge overruled him. Then I kept going. I walked the court through dates, account numbers, property records, internal emails, and ledger discrepancies with the patience of someone who had lived inside those facts long enough to know they would hold. I did not speculate. I did not accuse more than I could prove. I simply laid each stone down where it belonged, and little by little, the shape of the truth emerged. Daniel shifted constantly in his seat. My father stopped looking at me altogether. Mr. Halpern tried 3 more objections, lost all 3. Then came Margaret Ellis's records. Those changed everything because until then, the defense could still pretend this was interpretation. A matter of perspective. But Margaret's timeline connected the internal transfers to outside accounting records in a way that left no room for confusion. The judge studied the documents for a long moment. Then she looked at my father. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "were you aware of these transfers at the time they were made?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. That was the first time I had ever seen him speechless. Not angry, not commanding, not dismissive, speechless. He reached for a glass of water that wasn't there. His hand trembled just slightly, but I saw it, and so did everyone else. For all the years I had stood in his shadow, for all the decades he had mistaken my silence for weakness, it came down to that tiny human gesture. A shaking hand. Judge Hensley turned back to the record. Mr. Halpern sat down slowly as though some invisible support had been removed from the room. And I understood, standing there with my papers and my steady voice, and the whole buried weight of my life finally taking form in daylight. This was the moment my father stopped seeing the daughter he could dismiss and started seeing the witness he could not control. Once the truth is spoken plainly, people like to imagine the room erupts. Voices rise, faces collapse, someone confesses, someone storms out. But that isn't how it happened. In real life, especially in a courtroom, truth often arrives quietly. It settles over people in layers, forcing each person to decide how long they can keep pretending not to feel its weight. That was what happened that morning. After Judge Hensley reviewed the exhibit, she asked for a short recess. The bailiff called it, and everyone stood. Chairs scraped. Papers shifted. A murmur moved through the gallery like a breeze through dry leaves. My father remained seated for a moment before slowly pushing himself up. Daniel leaned toward him, saying something I couldn't hear. My father snapped back a reply under his breath, and Daniel pulled away like a scolded boy, though he was in his 50s. Mr. Halpern gathered his notes, but there was no confidence in his movements anymore. He looked like a man trying to repair a roof in the middle of a storm, knowing full well the beams underneath were already rotten. I stayed where I was. I didn't want coffee. I didn't want air. I didn't want sympathy from strangers who had spent the first half of the hearing wondering whether I was a fool. I simply sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and let the silence come. My heart was pounding now that the speaking part was over. There's something strange about adrenaline at my age. When I was younger, it felt like fire. That day, it felt more like vibration, fine and steady, moving through my bones. Judge Hensley had not ruled yet. I knew better than to celebrate too early. Facts matter in court, yes, but procedure matters too. Framing matters. Timing matters. One strong argument does not guarantee a final outcome. Still, I knew the air had changed, and so did they. During the recess, I caught Daniel looking at me, really looking at me for the first time in years. There was no warmth in it, but there wasn't contempt either. It was something sadder than that. Recognition. Not of who I had become, but of who I had always been and what it had cost him to pretend otherwise. He started walking toward me, then stopped when my father said his name sharply from across the aisle. Daniel turned back and followed. That told me everything I needed to know. Some people grow older. Some people simply remain obedient. When the hearing resumed, Mr. Halpern's tone had changed completely. The smooth certainty was gone. In its place was caution. He tried to reframe the transfers as administrative decisions made under pressure. He suggested my father had relied too heavily on Daniel. He implied there may have been confusion rather than misconduct. Confusion. That was the word he reached for when the earlier version of events collapsed. Judge Hensley listened, but her face gave nothing away. Then she asked a question that cut straight through all of it. Was Miss Callahan ever informed, she said, that the assets she managed were being reassigned despite her long-standing operational role in documented oversight? No one answered immediately because there was no good answer. Mr. Halpern looked at my father. My father looked straight ahead. Daniel looked down. Finally, Mr. Halpern said, "Not formally, Your Honor. Not formally." Another elegant lie. As if the problem were etiquette instead of betrayal. I was allowed a brief response. I stood again, though more slowly this time, and said, "Your Honor, I was not informed formally, informally, privately, publicly, or ethically." There were a few muffled sounds in the gallery, nothing loud, just the quiet reaction of people hearing plain language after too much legal polishing. Judge Hensley gave the smallest nod. I sat back down, and for the first time that day I felt something like peace. Not victory, peace. Because no matter what came next, the truth had entered the record in full view. It would not be buried again. The ruling came that afternoon. Judge Hensley found that the transfers and removals of responsibility had been carried out without proper disclosure, without adequate fiduciary transparency, and under circumstances that raised serious concerns about internal misconduct. She ordered an immediate freeze on several disputed assets, a formal forensic accounting review, and temporary restoration of my access to records relevant to the case. She also stated, in language calm enough to be devastating, that my role in the company had been substantive, long-standing, and materially significant despite repeated attempts to minimize it. Materially significant. I had waited 30 years to hear someone in authority describe my work honestly. I did not cry. Not there. But something inside me loosened like a knot pulled tight for decades had finally begun to give way. My father stared ahead as the ruling was read, his face drained of color. Daniel looked ill. Mr. Halpern took notes, though I could tell from his expression he was already thinking beyond the case, toward damage control, toward reputation, toward the very American business of surviving disgrace in a pressed suit. When it was over, the bailiff dismissed us. That should have been the end of the moment, but my father stood abruptly and turned toward me. "Are you proud of yourself?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud. That made it worse, because I heard what was underneath it. Not remorse, not reflection, humiliation. He was not wounded by what he had done. He was wounded by being seen. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No," I said. "I'm sad it had to come to this." His jaw tightened. "You made a spectacle of this family." I almost laughed then, not out of cruelty, but out of sheer disbelief. Family. That word again, dragged out only when he needed cover. "You did that yourself," I said quietly. Daniel stepped between us then, not physically blocking anything, just hovering the way men do when they're afraid conflict will become visible enough that they'll have to choose a side. For once, I didn't make it easier for him. I picked up my folders, turned, and walked out. Outside, the air was cold and clean. Late fall in Ohio has a way of telling the truth about things. Trees stripped down, sky wide open, nothing hidden by bloom or heat. I stood on the courthouse steps for a long minute just breathing. Professor Green was waiting near the curb with his coat buttoned up to the neck. He hadn't come inside for the hearing. He said later that he trusted I no longer needed someone watching over me. He was right. "Well," he asked. I gave him the brief version. He listened, then smiled, not broadly, just enough to show he understood what the day truly meant. "And how do you feel?" he asked. I thought about that. "Lighter," I said. Then, after a pause, and tired. He chuckled softly. "That sounds about right." We walked to the corner cafe and sat by the window with 2 cups of coffee that went lukewarm while I talked. Not about the ruling, not at first. About my mother. About the office. About the years I had mistaken endurance for duty. At some point, I said I thought winning would feel better. Professor Green stirred his coffee and said, "Justice rarely feels triumphant to decent people. It usually feels expensive." He was right about that, too, because even as relief settled in, another truth rose beside it. I had not wanted my father destroyed. I had wanted him honest, and there is a difference. Over the next few weeks, the consequences unfolded exactly the way consequences do in a small American town. Quietly at first, then all at once. Clients began asking questions. A bank delayed financing on one of Daniel's projects pending the review. 2 longtime tenants requested direct documentation on ownership and management authority. People who had once smiled too quickly at my father in restaurants now seemed fascinated by menus when he entered the room. Reputation is fragile at any age, but in later life, when so much of a person's identity rests on what they have built publicly, even small fractures feel seismic. Daniel called me once during that period. I let it ring, then answered on the 4th try. He didn't apologize, not directly. Instead, he said, "You didn't have to go that far." I looked out the kitchen window at the bare maple tree in the yard and said, "Neither did you." He was silent. Then he said in a voice I barely recognized, "I didn't think he'd ever turn on me, too." That sentence stayed with me after I hung up, because there it was, the real inheritance my father had handed down. Not discipline, not leadership, not legacy, fear, and fear always demands a sacrifice. This time, it simply ran out of daughters to feed on. The months that followed, life didn't suddenly become easier. That's something people don't always say out loud. They like neat endings, clear victories, a sense that once the truth is spoken, everything falls into place. But real life, especially later in life, doesn't work that way. It settles slowly. The forensic review took time. Weeks turned into months. And while the findings continued to support what I had presented, there were still procedures, adjustments, legal steps that had to be followed. The court's decision gave me access again, access to records, to operations, to the truth as it had always existed behind closed doors. But I didn't rush back into the business the way some people expected. I went back carefully, deliberately. The office felt smaller than I remembered, not physically but in meaning. For so many years, it had been my entire world, the place where I had poured my time, my energy, my identity. Now, as I sat at that same desk, looking at the same filing cabinets, the same worn carpet, the same ticking wall clock, I saw it differently. It wasn't my life. It was just a part of it. And that realization brought a kind of peace I hadn't expected. Daniel avoided me at first. When we did cross paths, it was brief, professional, careful. Gone were the easy assumptions, the quiet dismissals. In their place was distance, not hostile but uncertain. My father didn't come into the office at all, not for weeks. Then one morning, without announcement, he walked in. I was at my desk reviewing a lease agreement when I felt the shift in the room. That same old presence, the one I had spent most of my life responding to without even thinking. I looked up. He stood there, coat still on, hat in his hands. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Time does something strange to people. It doesn't always soften them, but it reveals things they can no longer hide. He looked older, not just in years, but in weight. "I didn't expect you back here," he said. His voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I didn't expect to leave," I replied. That wasn't meant to be sharp, just honest. He nodded slightly as if that answer made sense to him in a way it wouldn't have before. I suppose I didn't either. There was a long pause, the kind that used to make me uncomfortable, the kind I used to rush to fill, but not anymore. "I made mistakes," he said finally. I waited. "I trusted the wrong things," he continued. Focused on the wrong things. It wasn't a full apology. Not the kind you hear in movies, but it was the closest he had ever come. "I should have seen you," he added after a moment. That one landed. Not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged something real. "I was always here," I said. He nodded again slowly. "I know that now." We didn't hug, we didn't suddenly become something we had never been, but something shifted. Respect. Not the kind that comes from authority, the kind that comes from recognition, and at our age, that matters more. Daniel came in later that day. He stood in the doorway of my office the same way I had stood in my father's doorway years before. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said something I had learned the hard way. "You don't fix it all at once." He frowned slightly. "Then how?" "You start by telling the truth," I said, "even when it costs you something." He didn't respond right away, but he didn't walk away either. And sometimes that's the beginning. I didn't stay in the business forever. That surprises people. After everything I had fought for, they expected me to take control, expand it, rebuild it in my image. But that was never what I wanted. What I wanted was my voice back. And once I had it, I realized I could use it in ways I hadn't imagined before. I began volunteering at a local legal aid clinic, mostly helping older adults, people my age or older who found themselves overwhelmed by paperwork, contracts, situations they didn't fully understand. People who had trusted someone and been let down. I didn't give dramatic speeches. I didn't tell them what to do. I listened. Then I helped them see clearly, because clarity is power, and it's something no one should be denied simply because they were taught to stay quiet. My father and I see each other now, not often but enough. We sit sometimes on his back porch watching the same stretch of yard I played in as a child. We don't talk about the case. We don't revisit the past in detail. But there's a different kind of silence between us now. Not the old silence. Not the one filled with things unsaid. This one is understood. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that strength doesn't always look the way we expect it to. It doesn't always come early. It doesn't always come loudly. Sometimes it comes after years of being overlooked. After years of thinking you've missed your chance. After years of believing your role was simply to support others. And then one day you realize your voice was never gone. You just hadn't used it yet. So if you're listening to this, if you've ever felt dismissed, underestimated, or quietly pushed aside, I want you to remember something. It is never too late to stand up. Never too late to learn. Never too late to tell the truth. And when you do, you may not get applause. You may not even feel victory the way you imagined. but you will feel something better. You will feel whole. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to reflect on your own journey. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, or simply sit with it quietly. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories about strength, truth, and second chances, consider staying with us. Because sometimes the quietest voices have the strongest stories. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe to the channel for more narratives about justice and perseverance, and tell us in the comments. What's the most satisfying moment of truth you've ever witnessed or experienced? We read every single one. And remember, silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it's just patience, waiting for the right moment to speak.